Hey everyone, and welcome to Pathfinder, presented by Payload, the leading digital media company in the space industry. I'm your host, Mo Islam, and today we're joined by Topher Haddad, the co-founder and CEO of Albedo. Albedo is building satellites to provide ultra-high-resolution optical imagery from space. We're talking resolution quality that's higher than anything else available in the commercial market today. Part of how they do it? Operating in what's called Very Low Earth Orbit, or VLEO. A lot to cover, but before we get into it, a quick word from our sponsors. SpiderOak's Orbit Secure software is designed for hybrid space operators struggling to manage the chaos of securing data flow and access to and from tens of thousands of small satellites in low Earth orbit. Using a unique combination of end-to-end zero-trust encryption and blockchain distributed ledger, Orbit Secure allows your mission to orchestrate and secure Earth-to-orbit, orbit-to-Earth transmission, communication, and storage of sensitive data across even the most complex and unsecure hybrid space environments. To learn how Orbit Secure can bring zero-trust security and resiliency to your zero-gravity environments, check out SpiderOak at www.spideroak.com. Topher, welcome to the show.
Thanks, Mo. Excited to be here.
Where are you calling in from today?
I'm in Denver, specifically Broomfield, Colorado, at our new manufacturing spot here. And I'm also ditching that Texas summer for about 4 months, so that's convenient as well.
Yeah, I noticed a different background, so I had to ask. But we're going to get into the manufacturing. We're going to get into the new facility in a little bit, but we're going to start off with a very easy softball question just to kick it off, which is, so you are the co-founder and CEO of a company called Albedo. So what does Albedo do? And why isn't it just another Earth observation remote sensing company?
Yeah, great question. Thanks, Mo. And super excited to be here. Been a long-time listener of Payload, big fan. PR department had to pull a lot of strings to get on here, as y'all are getting popular these days. But yeah, so we are Albedo. We build and will operate satellites that fly very low in what's called Very Low Earth Orbit, or VLEO. So it's about twice as close to the Earth as normal LEO or low Earth orbit satellites fly. And it's a part of space that hasn't been commercialized yet. There's been a few research missions that have flown there, but we'll be the first ones to commercialize it at scale, ultimately creating a new platform with big advantages for Earth observation. Because as you can imagine, if you take a camera and put it much closer to the Earth, the pictures from that camera will be much higher resolution or much granular. And so that's how we'll be leveraging our platform to start, is by building satellites that collect two types of imagery: optical imagery and thermal infrared imagery in the long wave part of the spectrum. Both at very high resolution, 10 centimeters per pixel in the optical and 2 meters per pixel in the thermal, which is a resolution that today you can only get from planes or drones, which come with a lot of inherent limitations from a platform perspective. And so now we'll be able to offer our customers the same level of certainty that you get from planes or drones, which we call aerial imagery, but now do it at a global scale with all the benefits you get from a satellite platform. So, global coverage over the whole Earth, both rural and metro areas, imaging spots much more frequently and on demand, and ultimately making it more affordable than paying a pilot to go fly over your power lines or buying a nice drone and flying it over your farm every week. So that's us in a nutshell. We have been around for about 2.5 years, and we launched our first satellite in early 2025.
That's a lot to unpack. I feel like we covered like half the show.
Yeah. We're good to go. I got another meeting actually.
All right. So tell me how you got into this. Were you always a satellite guy? Were you always EO? Were you always interested in imagery? Like, how did you get into this?
Yeah, great question. To be honest, I didn't necessarily grow up set on working in the space industry, but I feel super lucky that my first job out of school was in the industry. I started my career at Lockheed Martin in the Bay Area. I did my undergrad at UT Austin, and I knew that I liked engineering, and I knew that I wanted to move to San Francisco because it seemed like things were happening there. And by sheer luck, got the job at Lockheed Martin and did a mix of kind of system architecture work and then more of a specialty in optics and imaging science, mostly working on classified remote sensing satellites for the U.S. government. So a lot of stuff I can't really talk about, but more kind of conceptual studies, like, a customer would come to us and as an example and say, I need to image these different spots once a week and be able to resolve these specific features or like this temperature different accuracy or whatever. And so I would put that into, well, we could fly, 4 satellites in this orbit with these sensors, or 6 satellites in this orbit, and kind of do those different trades. So that's a lot of what I did. Really, fell in love with the imagery world, the space world, and not only the engineering side, but also getting to see the application side, specifically in the area I worked, of what it's done for our national security and our country kind of behind the scenes. So was very fortunate to do that for about 5 years. And then, we can dive into how Albedo came to be, or
So I think it's fun. It's interesting because this sounds quite familiar to a number of companies that have startups that have formed as of recently, which is someone smart, intelligent, driven like yourself. Right out of college, joins a prime, and then 5 to 10 years of working at that prime, realize there's something here that I've learned. I've gathered a very important, a very critical skill set, but it's happening too slow here, and I need to go off and do this on my own. Is that effectively, or in one way, the birth of Albedo?
Kind of. Yeah, in a way. I would say, I got to a point after about 5 years where, and I loved my time there. I had a blast, worked with great people, but was definitely starting to see the momentum in the new space kind of world, and just different companies that were popping up. I remember distinctly driving down from San Francisco to Sunnyvale, seeing the first Planet Labs billboard in 2017 or something. I was like, oh, that's cool. But I didn't think I was going to start a company per se. I started kind of looking for what other startups were out there. And then this idea kind of just fell in my lap, thanks to a former president that tweeted a classified satellite image, which is a whole story that I can dive into.
Well, let's actually dive into that story, because I have heard that. I have heard that story, and it is a good story, and it's pretty. I think it's pretty telling in terms of what the EO industry was and what it's starting to turn into. So let's dive right in.
Yeah. So around that time, starting to look in the new space world, Trump tweeted this satellite image of an Iranian missile failure. And people saw it and they were like, whoa, there's a ton of detail in this image. You can see, detailed characteristics about the missile and the damage, individual stair steps, all these features that you can't really make out today with commercial satellites. And so people, concluded this must be from a top secret satellite. They estimated the resolution was about 10 centimeters per pixel. So that's the size of a single pixel on the ground. And it sparked this conversation in the commercial industry around what you could do if you had 10 centimeter satellite imagery commercially, how it would solve all these use cases and applications that you have to fly drones or planes for today. But the experts concluded, it would be game changing, but it would probably cost $1 to $2 billion per satellite, because that satellite would have to be the size of Hubble, which is the size of a school bus. And for space telescopes, that's going to be over $1 billion. And as I read that, kind of off the cuff, I was like, well, you could probably do it cheaper today. You could fly lower, which would shrink the size of the telescope you need, et cetera. But I really just couldn't get it out of my mind. And it kind of catalyzed what I call the rabbit hole apocalypse for me, where I just kept going down rabbit hole after rabbit hole of finding these different pieces of this puzzle that basically were answering the question of, well, how low could we fly today? Didn't even really know VLEO was a formal category at the time, but just basically all these puzzle pieces of technology, regulations, space infrastructure, markets that got me to the point where I was like, I think we could do this at a huge fraction of the price point than that $1 billion price point that the experts mentioned. And so looped in some amazing co-founders, Winston and AJ. We did Y Combinator, which was super valuable for us. Spent a ton of time in those early days talking to customers and, going in with the technology idea for this VLEO platform, but then really validating, hey, is there a big market, venture scale market for this? And we joked that we probably had the highest response rate in terms of cold outreach during the YC days, because if you're in the industry and you see, at least in 2021, 10 centimeter satellite imagery question mark in the subject line, you're probably going to respond, even if it's just to say, you guys are idiots. This is never going to work. And so
was that the subject line you guys used? 10 centimeters.
I think Winston did most of the outbound. I think it was interested in 10 centimeter satellite imaging question mark.
That's really good. Let's actually pause for a second, because I think we've thrown around some jargon, and I just want to make sure that we do some kind of definitional work. So taking a very quick step back, let's talk really quickly. A quick primer on a typical metric used around satellite resolution, so spatial resolution. How is it typically measured? Let's talk about that, because I think that'll kind of help level set the conversation.
Yeah, great point. So native resolution is measured as the size of a pixel on the ground. And so if you're watching the video, you can kind of see my hands here. But basically, for us, we're 10 centimeters. So that's 10 centimeters here and 10 centimeters here for a single pixel. And so when you think about the actual usage of satellite images and using computer vision and AI to extract features and identify objects, it's really a two-dimensional measurement of, do I have 3x3 pixels on this car, and how much confidence and what can I identify with that 3x3 pixel crop? And so it's a two-dimensional measurement, but we basically simplify it to just say 10 centimeters, 20 centimeters, 30 centimeters.
So if we were talking about difference in magnitude, so is a 1 meter resolution, so 100 centimeters, 1 meter resolution image 10 times worse than a 10 centimeter resolution? How do you think about?
Well, I appreciate the cue up on this, because this is something. Yeah, I think that's not appreciated, but it's 100 times more information because it's a squared effect. And so if you think about a 1 meter, what's a 1 meter object? Like let's just say a car, a 1 meter
Sure.
resolution pixel, you'd have a single pixel on a car. So there's no way you could identify that's an automobile. But with 10 centimeters, you have 100 pixels on that car. And so you have a much more resolute kind of aspect. And so that's where, for us, we're 9 times better in terms of 9 times more pixels than today's state of the art commercially, which is 30 centimeters.
Exactly. Yeah. So I had to get that out of the way because it was a very easy mistake I made when I was first looking at remote sensing technology. So
yeah,
I appreciate that. So let's talk really quickly. So what is the best available commercial resolution today?
Good question. So there's 3 satellites in orbit today, I believe, that capture 30 centimeter resolution. Maxar has 1, and then Airbus has 2. Actually, there might be. Well, I think a launch is going today with maybe one of Planet's. But so yeah, 3 satellites that collect 30 centimeters. In terms of what's really like available commercially, I think by and large it's more 50 centimeter imagery, because
Right.
those 3 satellites are just very supply limited because there's a lot of demand for high resolution. And so, 30, 50 centimeters is kind of the state of art today.
Okay, so you're talking about a very substantial improvement in resolution quality with what you're building at Albedo. So let's talk, and I know a lot of that is hinged upon this concept, or not this concept, but the area of orbit, which you've referred to earlier as very low Earth orbit, right? So VLEO. So maybe talk a little bit about what does that mean, and how does that work, and why did you choose to operate in VLEO?
So the 2 high-level knobs you have if you're sizing a satellite to get a given resolution, first-order physics, are the diameter of the telescope that you're using and the distance to the Earth. And so essentially, if you cut that distance in half, you can shrink that other knob, the diameter of the telescope, substantially. And with space telescopes, they, thinking about Hubble and James Webb and these kind of big commercial telescopes, the cost of a satellite scales exponentially with the diameter of the aperture or the telescope. And so there's huge cost reductions that can be had if you can shrink that aperture down substantially. And so that's where the VLEO, the low flying aspect, is really beneficial for us, is we can now collect this resolution with a much smaller satellite. And granted, it's bigger than kind of what you would think of in new space of the CubeSat. Like one of our internal hashtags is not a CubeSat. It's a pretty complex, big space robot, but it's much smaller than what would historically be required to capture this resolution, thinking back to, the Trump tweet.
And if we're talking about, traditional LEO versus VLEO, let's just use the simple terminology of just altitude. How different are those? How far apart is that distance?
The easiest way to frame it is just 2x. It's twice as close. VLEO is twice as close as LEO, but it's all a spectrum. Like, LEO is say 500 to 800 kilometers. But when you think about today's current imaging satellites, so like the Maxar and Airbus ones that I mentioned, I think we just assume we're about twice as close as those.
Right. So, okay. So the initial question that comes to mind, right? You're operating twice as close to Earth, which means that the gravitational pull of Earth is a lot stronger, right? So maybe talk about what are the technological innovations that require you to operate in VLEO?
Great question. There are a handful of things, and a lot of them kind of tied to the why now aspect and that kind of rabbit hole apocalypse I was talking about, where there's viable technologies that we can leverage today that have reached a point of maturity that enable VLEO on top of kind of our core technology and secret sauce that we add on top of it. So for one, I think just by and large, everything about VLEO is first principles. You have to design for your environment, as with any spacecraft. And with VLEO, there's a lot of very specific effects around material selection used, atomic oxygen environments, the drag from the atmosphere, how you orient imaging, downlinking data, thrusting to stay in orbit, and kind of all these different choreographed operations that are really complex. But really the hardest part of doing this is the pointing and control and stability that's required to do not only high resolution, but in high resolution in VLEO. And so that's where kind of a lot of our core engineering team comes from, a background in traditional aerospace, but in the classified environment, which is really the only place where this kind of technology has been built before. And so all those lessons learned and kind of experience there, because if you imagine a high resolution pixel, the angle that's coming off that pixel is tiny. And so if you're trying to take a picture while the satellite's zipping around the Earth at over 7 kilometers a second, that picture can't be blurry. And then you have to rapidly repoint the satellite to take a picture of a different target. Like if we're flying over, Denver and we need a shot of Boulder too, being able to rapidly repoint while making that picture not blurry. So that's kind of the hardest part of this, on top of the specific type of sensor that we use, which is called a line scanner, that enables us to close the business model. Because otherwise, if you're just a point and shoot camera, you're collecting much smaller images at this resolution. And so that pointing and control aspect is what's really challenging about both the VLEO mission and doing high resolution optical imagery.
So there's a number of satellite constellations that I'm aware of that have basically committed hundreds of millions, if not maybe in the billions of capital to build out a constellation that is in the, call it 30 to 15 centimeter resolution quality. So, Albedo is a relatively new company that's now, targeting a much lower cost structure around a much higher resolution quality. So is this a sort of now is the perfect time because there have been these substantial technological improvements, or the tech has now become viable? Is it more a question of like, hey, now is the right time to be, and you're in a great position because you're able to build from the ground up in first, like you mentioned, first principles, because the tech is now finally ready to be able to pull something off like this?
Yeah, that's a great way to put it. I think we're fortunate in a lot of ways from a timing perspective. I mean, there's a lot of things, whether it's ground stations as a service, AI, cloud native ground systems, all that we can leverage. But I think to your point, the key aspect of that lucky timing is that we can take that first principles approach to VLEO, design our system specific for that. And from a competition perspective, a lot of the kind of traditional players here are locked into those multi-$100 million investments that are still cutting edge technology, but not something that can necessarily just be lowered in altitude to VLEO. It would still take kind of a new first principles approach to design that type of system. So I think that's why we stand out and why we're one of the only ones right now doing VLEO, is because it does take that first principles approach that really wasn't possible to take until a few years ago.
Right. Okay. All right. There's a lot of questions have come up in my mind. So let's take a quick step back. What is maybe let's just talk about your initial product, right? What are you building right now? Where are you guys at with it? When I assume, actually not I assume, I know you don't have any satellites up in orbit right now, but when do you plan on getting your first satellite up in orbit, and what does that constellation look like over the next few years?
Our first satellite will launch in early 2025, and we'll be capturing both high resolution optical and thermal infrared imagery from the same platform at the same time. And we, starting out, we'll sell imagery as a service, kind of like the traditional model. We'll have some unique kind of products around the size of imagery you can task and the way that you task our satellites. We're really focusing on modernizing that user experience, but ultimately we'll be serving these pixels initially to a lot of these customers that either have relied on aerial imagery today in insurance, precision agriculture, mapping, and things like that, or to customers that have been exploring satellite imagery but haven't quite gotten to the level of certainty that they need with the resolutions that are available today. So oil and gas and mapping and financial services, banks, construction, industries like that. And so first satellite will go up early 2025. We'll have a second one up later that year. And then by the end of 2026, we'll achieve daily revisit rates with 6 satellites in orbit. So we're not necessarily a company that needs, thousands of satellites in orbit to achieve an MVP, a minimum viable product. We can do a lot with a few number of satellites, similar to the Maxars and Airbuses of the world that don't have, these massive constellations, because we're putting a lot more tech into the single satellite. So daily revisit by the end of 2026. By and large, most of these customers that are, monitoring power lines, monitoring their crops and agriculture and others, don't need like super high revisit rates. It's more of a weekly to monthly cadence. So it's really more about capacity of how many satellites we need to serve all the demand that's out there. And so that's something that, we'll be able to measure over time. But yeah, initially that first product, just to kind of sum it up, is high-res optical imagery, high-res thermal imagery, and then what we've trademarked are Vis-Sharp Thermal, or VSTs, which is actually fusing the two together. And there's a lot of powerful stuff that you can do with that as well.
Why optical and thermal to start?
So optical is the most driving and kind of rigorous requirements in terms of, the optics that you have and how much you have to polish them, the pointing and control stability that I was talking about earlier. And really where the big market opportunity is for us, and kind of where the key insight was early on, was getting to this resolution, getting to that aerial quality, and being able to serve all those applications, both commercial and government, at a global scale. And we added we knew, once you do the optical, that creates a platform where you can do these other modalities as well. And so where do we start along with the optical? And long wave infrared made the most sense for us. There's kind of 3 categories in the infrared spectrum. There's reflective infrared, which is shortwave or SWIR, and then there's thermal infrared, which is medium and long wave. And so long wave is a category where there's really very little today available from space. There's a couple NASA and ESA satellites that do like very low resolution long wave, but that is kind of tied to where most of the thermal signatures from ambient temperatures exist, around like the temperatures that we're used to feeling. And so what's cool about it, and why we added it on, aside from like the tech low marginal cost of adding it on, is also that it complements every specific use case, almost every use case that we have for the optical. So if you think like, what's the traditional hedge fund use case of counting cars at 10 centimeters? Now you can count cars. You can also identify cars. And with the thermal, you can see, a car probably just pulled out from that spot because that pavement is colder than the rest. Or property insurance, what's the material of that roof? What is the health of the roof? And then you add on the thermal, and you can now reduce ambiguities around the material types. Or you can identify, is that a pool or a hot tub? Or is that a shed in the backyard or a dwelling unit because the AC? And so that's partly why we selected the long wave, is it really complements each specific use case with additional insights that you can get on top of the resolution increase in the optical.
Right. Now let's actually, you brought up a few different use cases. So let's just dive into that for a second. So the resolution quality that you're offering is substantially higher than what's available in the market, right? And has been available. I mean, the NOAA license that you won, right, which we talk about, that you're the first company. Are you the only company to have won that award, as far as you know?
We are, but it's not like FCC where they publish the specific details of the license. So theoretically, someone else could have a license for it.
I see. Okay.
We think we were the first to announce. We started the company shortly after they changed the regulations, which it was still fuzzy at the time, but it was a new structure. And so, I don't think that's ever necessarily been the barrier to doing this. It was more the technology, but it is definitely an enabler now that we can get that license.
Yeah. So how do you think about demand for resolution quality that was never available to the commercial markets? How do you think about like how much there's and I don't think 10 centimeter is that mark, but there's a mark, right? There's a resolution quality at some point where it's like, hey, I don't really need it to be this high. Right. At some point, right. There might be, and maybe I'm wrong on that, but I'm kind of curious, like, as you're building your company and you're thinking about commercial and government demand, how do you think about 10 centimeters from a perspective of like, hey, this is going to pull in a lot of demand from those 30 centimeter or those 50 centimeter or those 1 meter customers? How do you think about that?
Yeah, good question. So I think there's probably, there's a few different components of that to hit. One is there's the proven markets that have used 10 centimeter imagery, and those are customers of the aerial imagery companies. And so there's 10 centimeter imagery out there today from planes, but it's fragmented. It's limited to metros, collected infrequently, et cetera. And so that's where like property insurance, precision agriculture, mapping, real estate can be kind of a drop-in replacement of, oh, we're a global company. Now we only have to work with Albedo opposed to 10 different aerial companies. And so that kind of is the value proposition there and the cost. There's the existing satellite imagery customers as number two, where they've been, exploring satellite imagery and have started using it. Maybe let's say utilities, vegetation management around power lines to look for vegetation that could encroach and spark a wildfire. And so for them, they are getting value today out of the satellite imagery, but a lot of this is about certainty. And especially in this age of AI, it's none of this is binary where you can either measure a feature or not, or you can identify a feature or not. It's all kind of an accuracy scale. And so for a utilities customer, if they're deciding whether to send out all their crews to cut down, vegetation that's going to hit a power line, to be able to actually like pull back on that and automate it, they need to be able to see 95, 98% accuracies or confidence that this tree isn't going to fall on a power line. And so that's where I think the opportunity for us, for existing users of satellite imagery, is a good opportunity of that certainty that they get between, 50 or 30 centimeters, which is maybe 50 to 60% accurate, versus at 10 centimeters, you're getting more in the 90% accuracies. And so that's an opportunity for us. And then I think the third category is just what's the unlock? When you combine these two platforms of aerial and satellite, what does that unlock that we don't even know about today? And so that's where, we're excited to really modernize the user experience for buying satellite imagery so that we can make it available to the new ideas and, the really smart people out there that are going to come up with new stuff.
Well, let's talk about the use case that we started this conversation with, which was the image, the military image, right?
Yeah.
So the government has 10 centimeter resolution capability, right? That's seemingly obvious based on the fact that they had an image, right, of that quality. Is that right to say?
I will let the listeners look at Twitter to answer that, opposed to answering it directly. Yeah, I mean, I think it's
So clearly, the government's going to be a big potential use case or a big customer for what you're doing here, because they clearly need it, they clearly want it. How do you think about sort of approaching the government customer versus the commercial customer? How does your kind of early traction look like? I don't know what you've shared publicly, but to the extent that you can share anything, I think that'd be helpful to hear.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah, so we, I think ideally, if I were to, predict the future or create the future, our revenue would be 50-50 split long-term at scale between commercial and government. We are big believers in the commercial side. We've gotten a ton of traction there and understand where the value is there, both in terms of traditional big commercial industries and on the climate side, across, solar panel sizing for roofs, precision agriculture, wildfire prevention. Like there's a lot of different climate angles as well. But defense and intelligence are also, very sophisticated and have a big appetite for this type of data. And so with the government, they do, like you said, according to Twitter, they probably do have 10 centimeter capabilities. But I think the reality is that if your satellites cost, what at $1 billion, $2 billion, whatever that number was from the article, you probably can't build that many of them. And so they're pretty supply limited in terms of users that need high res imagery for a specific application. So that supply limitation is where, we'll be really valuable of not only providing the imagery in an unclassified environment, but also just adding to the supply of what they would refer to as near 7 imagery. It's kind of a image quality rating scale of where commercial has never gone past near 6 and will be near 7, which unlocks a lot of different features that you can see in the images. And so we've gotten a lot of traction with the government on that front. We've won some phase 2 SBIRs. And another area they're really excited is the thermal infrared and the Bisharp thermal, where we can combine the two. We can image at night with the thermal and start to add on to those use cases as well, where it's like, this isn't just, we can't just identify that this is an MiG-25 fighter, but we can also see that it's either on or off and assume,
right.
Maybe it's about to take off or it's just landed. Or not only can we identify, the difference between this being a tank and a cargo truck, but also we can see, the activity around it. Is there people inside? Is it is it active or not? And so that thermal signature and overlaying that is something where they're super excited to be able to combine the two and do that in a commercial environment.
Yeah, that's pretty incredible. All right, well, we're gonna come back in just a second, Topher. We just need to hear another quick word from the sponsors, but I'll come back and we'll continue this conversation. I got a lot more questions to ask, so be prepared.
All right, let's do it.
We'll be right back. Space is the new frontier for cybersecurity. To quote the commander of the U.S. Space Force's Operations Command, cyber threats are unfortunately the soft underbelly of our global space networks. SpiderOak, the leader in space cybersecurity software, is dedicated to providing space operators with the solutions they need to protect hybrid space systems. Their Orbit Secure software uses a unique combination of end-to-end zero-trust encryption and blockchain distributed ledger, allowing missions to orchestrate and secure Earth-to-orbit, orbit-to-Earth transmission, communication, and storage of sensitive data across even the most complex and unsecure LEO and hybrid space systems. To learn how Orbit Secure can bring zero-trust security and resiliency to your zero-gravity environments, check out SpiderOak at www.spideroak.com. All right, Topher, welcome back. We were just talking about the use cases between government, commercial, and of course some of the early traction that you've had. So on your website, and I'm just gonna kind of put my customer hat on for a second. On your website, you have from space to server in under an hour. Can you explain sort of what that means for the potential customer and why that's important, why that's valuable?
Yes, and also shout out to Winston for coming up with a lot of that copy in the early days when he threw our website together on Webflow. And now we have a new one that we released last week with Landscape, which is we're super excited about. But yeah, Winston has a way of dialing in those words. So latency is a big parameter, important parameter for a lot of customers. How fast from image capture on the satellite do I get my pixels? And so for us, we're not only innovating on the resolution side, but also very much focused on those key performance parameters that users need when it comes to imagery. And so latency is something where on average will be, at least with the first few satellites, will be 30 minutes from capture to delivery. And that'll vary depending on the geographies where a satellite is orbiting at the time. But 95% of the time it will be under an hour. And so that's important for government defense users like we were just talking about, intelligence, other commercial domains like agriculture and some others that need that lower latency. And then some industries don't need it that fast. But ultimately, the faster you can get those pixels, the fresher they are for the customer. That means that you can get more value out of them and whatnot.
And are you providing the pixels themselves? Is there any other type of work that the customer is asking for or that you expect the customer to ask for on the analytical front that you'll be providing, or are you partnering with anyone else to provide that data? How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, it's a good question. And I think it's a fun topic to talk about in the industry because there's a lot of opposing views. What we know today is that we have a long line for high-res pixels from the customer perspective. And so that's what we're going to sell. Building this VLEO platform puts us in a great position to compound value over time in the way of like expanding more on the space side, expanding more on the software product side, and figuring out when, where, and how we go down the stack for the customer. And so a lot of it, we're just going to kind of wait and see once we get a few satellites up and we start to understand demand for pixels and how that changes, and also how the market has shaken out in terms of how many of these startups that are around today that are focused on one specific vertical and taking in a bunch of different data sources to build a product for insurance or for utilities or for agriculture. How successful are they, and can we lean on them to be analytics partners versus building other types of products? But I think the ideal world and like the ideal future that everybody in the industry wants is that there are a lot of different types of products that the data providers aren't building themselves, because that's really how I think you expand the market opportunity. But I think it's all at the end of the day, it's all capital allocation decisions of where are we going to get the biggest return on our investment? Is it building another satellite? Is it building a software product that a big customer in insurance is asking us to build? Or what does the market want?
Right. So just to kind of summarize here, it's what it sounds like you're saying is that you have more than enough demand on just the raw pixels, that you're focused on making sure that you guys deliver that on time. and at the quality that you're promising, right? Versus, worrying about sort of the next couple layers of the EO stack that I know everyone talks about, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. Okay. Got it. That makes sense. Let's talk. Let's jump back to the competitive landscape for a second. So, and I know we briefly touched on this, but right now, do you know of any other competitors that have announced plans for 10 centimeter resolution?
No.
And is the simple reason why is because it's just everyone's focused on the constellations that they've already announced, and it's going to take multiple years sort of before anyone gets around to like whatever the next iteration or the next upgrade cycle looks like for those constellations?
I think so. Yeah, I think that's why. There's another VLEO company, Earth Observant or EOI Space. I remember I was thinking about this today as I was thinking about the podcast, where in the early days of being a founder, you're learning so much. And I remember the first month when we were in Y Combinator, I stumbled upon EOI Space, this other VLEO company. And I texted Winston and AJ and I was like, oh my gosh, there's another VLEO company out there. And I texted some other founder friends that were further along and they're like, oh, that's great validation. That's a good thing, honestly. And so, but I have a very distinct memory of that. But they're working on VLEO. They're not 10 centimeter resolution. So we're native 10 centimeters. I'm not sure what their native is. But in terms of the players that are already on orbit, yeah, I think it kind of goes back to your point of they have their next gen constellations planned. It's both the capital investment, but also the cannibalizing of their own business. Whereas if they release, a higher res product than what they're selling today, they either have to charge a much higher premium for that or they cannibalize their own product. And so I think that gives us a great head start in terms of, spending the next year and a half building our core technology before we launch, while there's skeptics out there and there's questions of, whether we could really pull this off. But then once we do, we already have that kind of big head start. And so, yeah, we feel very much like an industry of one in terms of the actual resolution we're bringing. And also the only company that's doing both the optical and the infrared together, which is another kind of powerful mode.
So in this current market, right, as the new hot topic these days tends to be artificial intelligence, right? And how rapidly it's evolving and how rapidly the use cases are evolving. How do you think it's going to be? How do you think it's going to enable support or be utilized within the Earth observation market? Or more, maybe you can be more specific to Albedo.
Yeah, good question. Yeah, it's amazing what's happening with AI right now. So I think one of the key things. Well, there's I guess a couple ways we could look at this. So super resolution is a thing out there right now that's starting to pop up with remote sensing. That's valuable in some cases. It definitely makes the image look prettier, but most of remote sensing is asking a now question, like what is happening in the scene right now, not what has happened over the last 100 days. And that's where super resolution, it doesn't add a ton of value from an AI perspective to a lot of what our customers are asking for. But in terms of
what is super resolution?
Yeah, sorry, I just kind of brought that up. So it's basically, Maxar and Airbus have released some products. We'll release a product eventually as well, where and like I said, it is valuable for some use cases where they take their native resolution, so 30 centimeters for Maxar and Airbus today, and they run super resolution algorithms to double that or quadruple that to 15 centimeters. And so we'll do the same thing eventually from 10 to 5, but it's for most of these applications that are asking what's happening right now, it's not going to be as useful. And so, but there is some value in AI for that. But in terms of kind of information theory questions, and I think a point you brought up earlier around if AI continues to get better or what's that kind of limit in terms of resolution until you hit diminishing returns, that's where we still have a very long way to go in terms of the data we can capture from space. Today, mapping it to some mainstream applications that have proved some of these AI and computer vision concepts from an information theory perspective, one that we've been looking at is medical imaging. And so they've shown that the big improvements in terms of accuracy until you get to diminishing returns is from a 32 by 32 pixel crop to 128 by 128. And so if you think about satellite imagery today, we're talking about features like power line poles, automobiles, battle tanks, where we're looking at 3 by 3 pixels or 10 by 10 pixels or 32 by 32 pixels. And so to really get to those high accuracies, we have a long way to go in terms of actual resolution limits and what AI can do with that. And so I think as AI continues to get better, as computer vision continues to improve, that's going to really be a tailwind in terms of customers wanting the highest resolution that they can get to those very high certainty and confidence numbers.
Can we talk really quickly about sort of this concept of resolution versus revisits, which we did touch upon for a second? So, it sounds like within a few years, you'll have about 6 satellites, which will allow you to do daily revisits, right? But ultimately, if you were to do something like what some of the other constellations out there are trying to do, which are like daily scans of Earth, right? Which might require thousands of satellites at like the orbital plane that you're talking about. Maybe talk a little bit about like customer needs, right? And why focus on resolution over revisit?
Yeah. Good question. And we'll never be at the way that we're doing it. We'll never be the company that's scanning the entire landmass every day. We're much more of a tasking, targeted based approach. We'll image metro areas on a frequent basis, but otherwise it'll be tasking based. And so, a lot of what we like our customers need, and from those conversations, isn't these multi-revisit per days applications. Like if the utilities customer is trying to look at vegetation around power lines monthly, every few months is great for that. Oil and gas customers monitoring a project site, they may be daily at the most, but not multiple times per day. Property insurers filing or creating a premium. It's like, how often do you buy a house? That's when they're going to ping your property to underwrite the premium. And so it's not super high revisit rates. And then the other piece of it is that one thing I don't think we'll ever figure out for optical is how to see through clouds. And I hate saying that because I wish there was a solution for everything, but that just defies physics. And so that's where like radar and other modalities that can see through clouds are going to always be superior to some degree in terms of those ultra high revisit use cases. Because if you're relying on optical imagery 5 times a day to see something, then you have 2 days of cloudiness, like that's going to disrupt everything. And so that's not really a use case that we think is worth tackling, because then you compromise the resolution as well.
Right. Amazing. So I do want to talk a little bit about the current team. How many folks are you at right now?
Yeah, we're a little over 40.
40. Wow. Okay. And I know you are sitting in your new facility in Denver. So maybe talk a little bit about that, because first time I met you, you were sitting in Austin, Texas. Yeah. And I know there was it's a kind of interesting. I was actually talking to someone about this just the other day, how, for a hot second, it felt like Austin was going to start to pull in a lot of space companies. And I'm not saying that's still not the case. There's definitely a number of really great businesses out there that are building for the long run. But I'm kind of curious, like, what drove the decision to open up a facility in Denver? And it's a pretty large facility from what I've seen on the news. And it's part of it is also you're now bifurcating time between Austin and Denver. Was that talent related, or was that more sort of like customer related, that decision to have 2 offices now across those 2 areas?
Yeah, very much talent related. From our view, Denver is probably number 2 behind LA in terms of space talent, just given both the established and new space companies here. Austin, I agree with you. I think there was a point in time where it was like, wow, Austin is really going to pick up in terms of space talent. And it will. I think it will. I think it's just going to take longer than people expected. And there's still a lot of cool stuff going on there, and we still have a good hub there. But in terms of where it makes sense for us to build the hardware, do the manufacturing, and hire a lot of folks is in Denver. And we were born in the pandemic, and so we have a lot of remote in our core DNA, and really started out as a remote first company by philosophies, processes, how we do business. And so that's been really beneficial for us now that we've added this kind of big in-person hub, because we still have those, kind of core processes around, hey, if you walk down the hall and talk to someone, like send a few bullets in Slack to the other person that wasn't in that conversation and things like that. So right. I think we have a good trajectory on that front. But ultimately, Denver was very much like, hey, we're kicking up hiring at the beginning of this year, and we need to hire fast, and we need to, do it in a place where we're not asking people to move all the time. And so Denver was the right fit. But I'm still bullish on Austin. We still want to have a strong presence there. And I think as we start, launching satellites and hiring more of the very space specific engineering people, then we'll be able to build out a bit more in Austin. And then hopefully Elon can pick up, build some more stuff there to bring in more talent and really get that going. Because I think it has a lot of potential. There's definitely a lot of hype there, but it still doesn't quite have the talent pool that I think a lot of space companies need.
How are the competencies going to be divided between Austin and Denver? What's the main purpose of the new facility?
So new facility is assembly, integration, testing. Actually, putting all the components in the satellite together. So a lot of the hiring focus here is the hands-on engineers and actually doing kind of the lab work and kind of the risk reduction activities along with the actual integration and manufacturing. And so the way we look at hiring, at least right now, is that unless we need someone being hands-on or that needs to be here for the specific team, we're kind of remote by default. And that's worked really well for us from both, kind of a have your cake and eat it too perspective, where we can bring in the best talent. They don't have to move, but we don't have that hybrid disconnect that I think some companies have ended up with if you started out in person and then went remote. In terms of like Austin being a intentional hub for us, I think time will tell on how we play that out and how we look at that in terms of hiring and whatnot.
So, and how do you think how do you anticipate the team growing over the next few years? Where do you see more of that focus coming out of Denver? Do you foresee maybe another location, another facility?
Mostly Denver this year. Yeah, our big ramp was kind of beginning of the year through kind of probably the first 9 months of this year, and then it won't be as fast as it's been. But over probably the next 18 months or so, it'll largely be Denver hiring.
So I want to ask a question. I actually I don't think I've asked this question to anyone I've had on the show before yet. But I like the way you worded it on your website, which was, and I wonder if this is another Winston win. I'll call it Winston win. Distributed team, centralized culture. I really like kind of how you described, and I think you're alluding to a lot of it by just showcasing how much of your team is all over the country. But what does that mean? Distributed team, centralized culture. And by the way, I asked that because I've met a lot of folks from your company, and I've really enjoyed meeting almost all of them. It's a great group of folks that you've managed to hire. So how do you think about culture at the company? And I actually don't think I've asked anyone that question before. So
that's a great question. And I mean, we are so lucky. We have an amazing team. Everybody on the team is super stoked on the mission, on what we're doing, and is just like ready for it. So we're very fortunate with our culture that we have today. And actually, a lot of that I think came from I'll get to that. So that title was a Katie Betts title, Distributed Team, Centralized Culture. AJ had another good one in our first blog, I think, that we ripped off from TechCrunch, which was like, no one's talking about remote work from space or something fun like that. But essentially, I think the kind of the core things we're learning around still having that centralized, strong culture, even as a distributed team, is on sites where we get everyone together in person, both company-wide and small teams. And now it's nice to have a facility in Denver to do that. It's kind of our core processes and philosophies around how we communicate with each other, async versus sync, and that doesn't really change if you're in person or not. And at our first onsite, we actually there was 10 of us at the first onsite in summer 2021. And we sat around the table for a few hours and just jammed on what do we want our core values to be? Because one of the things YC taught us was it's not necessarily the founders that are going to set the culture. It's your first kind of 10 employees. That's really going to set the culture. And so we waited to get to that point, largely informed by Airbnb's culture, to create our core values. And that was really fruitful for us because we did it together. We landed on 7 that we really like, and that has really driven our culture. And even though we're distributed, and so it's been working well so far. It's definitely takes intentionality to create the same culture between in-person and remote, and it's not perfect. But yeah, that's it's kind of what we're working on.
I love that. So you talk a little bit about YC. I'm kind of curious because you went through YC a few years ago, right? If I'm not mistaken.
Yeah, early 2021.
And I don't think at the time space was a huge category for YC, and I know it's growing, and we'll talk about your current cap table in a second because I know Gary Tan and Initialized Capital are backers of Albedo, and obviously Gary Tan now runs YC. I'm kind of curious where, why, like sort of like when you went through YC, how space was looked at by the organization versus where it is today, and I guess where do you think it's going?
Yeah, it's definitely kicked up a lot since our batch.
You might not know the sorry, you might not know the answer to that question. I should at least give you that out, since obviously you don't run YC by any chance, but you have you've introduced me to a number of other really cool companies coming out of YC. So I just kind of, and I know you're close to the organization, so I'm kind of curious what you think.
Yeah, and we love YC. We learned, myself and my two co-founders, we're all first-time founders, and we learned a ton. And the network is amazing. The resources are amazing. We in our batch we had 4 space companies, and that was prior to our batch. There were only 8 space companies in YC, and some of the big success stories were Astronis, Relativity, and Momentous that had gone before us. And so then in our batch we had 4. Us, Stoke Space, who's building fully reusable rockets. They're crushing it. And then 2 other companies, Alba Orbital and Careweather Space. And then after our batch, I think there was probably around 4 on average each batch, even through now. And so I think YC has definitely put more focus on space and hard tech. Boom Aerospace did YC. There were some other hard tech success stories before us. But I will say, we get questions of like, is YC the right place for hard tech, or should I go to some more, deep tech focused accelerator? And I still think that YC was super valuable for us. There's definitely things that aren't applicable to like B2B SaaS, but by and large, the fundamental philosophies, the network, and the advice is very, very applicable for deep tech companies. I remember our first office hour with Eric Mijakovsky, who started Pebble, the first smartwatch company. He was our main advisor there. And we went in and we were like, all right, we're going to do this technical drone demo for our technology for demo day, yada, yada. And he was like, no, just go talk to customers. Spend the first 2 months like only talking to customers. And we were like, yeah, it's a good idea. And that was so core to us. So I think, by and large, we got a ton out of it.
That's awesome. What are some lessons that you've learned from your time at Lockheed Martin that's helped you in building Albedo, either do's or don'ts?
Yeah, good question. So we have a lot of Lockheed alum at the company. My co-founder AJ was also at Lockheed, and then actually my first boss and mentor out of undergrad, Warren Strong, was one of our first full-time hires at Albedo, and he's our lead architect here. And so that was cool to bring him on, and he's been essential for us. But a lot of our core team is from there. I think bringing the know-how and the experience from building those very capable, space robots that Lockheed built to the less constrained, faster moving kind of agile aerospace world is a great combination, because, we're not just plugging stuff together that we don't know if it's going to work. A lot of our team has the core background and experience and the scar tissue to know what works and what doesn't, but the bureaucracy, the speed, like everything is so different out here in the new space world. And so that has worked really well for us, on top of hiring a lot of folks from new space companies that come with the specific kind of processes that create agility, the hardware rich environments where you can iterate and move fast, and all those philosophies. So I think by and large, to sum up the answer, it's like building very complex systems from our Lockheed days and applying that in a much faster, freer environment. It has been a good combo.
Let me ask you, I know we're running out of time here. Let me ask you one last question. And you could think of it more as like sort of the Albedo kind of 10-year vision statement. And I want to go back to this building in VLEO concept, right? That you guys are focusing on, that you guys are working at. Once you've built sort of a number of satellites, and you're operating them in VLEO, and you've solved the drag problem, and obviously the positioning problem, and all the other things that we've mentioned in terms of like the sort of the variety of, I think, technical challenges that come with building in VLEO. What do you think that platform is ultimately going to enable you to do over the long run, right? Because you've now built a new architecture to be able to operate in a way that most constellations aren't operating. Right. So just kind of moving beyond even like optical imagery, beyond thermal imagery. How do you think about, what does the company look like over the long run? Yeah.
It's obviously hard to answer that, but I think we know today there's a ton of benefits across modalities. I mean, we're starting, we talked about the optical, we talked about the long wave infrared, but there's so much benefits for medium wave, MWIR, short wave, and other kind of parts of that spectrum in terms of the resolution, the accuracy, and all those things that you get. There's benefits for even other remote sensing modalities like RF sensing, lasers. Those modalities are proportional to like either a squared or even a quadratic relationship with range. So you can get up to a 16x benefit for those. And the other big thing about VLEO is it doesn't contribute to space debris. It's a self-cleaning orbit. And so, one, it's more sustainable. We don't contribute to the problem, but also in a worst case scenario where Kessler syndrome happens, LEO becomes unusable or FCC stops allowing all these mega constellations to operate there. There's also a lot of potential to use VLEO for other types of missions if it's the safe place to be. And so those are kind of, some of the things we know today. There's also a lot of value for technology demonstrations. Before you stand up a big operational system in LEO, you can scale it down in VLEO and burn down some risk that way. But I think there's going to be, there's always going to be a lot of demand for high resolution pixels, high resolution optical. There's going to be a lot of demand for the answers that you can get with those pixels. So building, different software products to provide those answers. And then ultimately, there's, I think, a lot that can be unlocked that we don't even know about today of what you can do when you cut, the main requirement for space missions, the altitude from the satellite to the Earth. Like, what is that mission performance you're going to get when you cut that in half? And if you can do it from a platform that's very stable and very agile, like ours is, there's a lot of potential to build more on that. So, so that's the vision. Ultimately serving our customers and solving their problems, and doing it in a way that is a good user experience. Like ordering a pizza from Domino's and being able to watch that driver bring you your pizza. That's not how it works today with buying a satellite image, but that's another area where we really want to please our customers.
Yeah, amazing. By the way, I lied. I have one more question.
Okay.
It's an easy one. So, out of the YC companies that you're aware of in space, who are you most excited about?
I will say, so Andy Laps and I stay in touch pretty closely from Stoke Space. We have a group called, it's called 4D, and there was a couple other companies in there that we all stay in touch a lot. And that's one of the nice things about YC is those founder relationships you make are just so crucial. If it's like an hour before the wire cut off and you're texting people are like, are you getting your money out of SVB? Like those types of things, that's a real story. But I'd say Stoke Space I'm pretty stoked about, pun intended, but they're crushing. Andy keeps me up to date, and they just are moving super fast and doing something that's, really crucial. I know, Mo, you wrote that launch is not commoditized or whatever that your newsletter was recently, and that's so true. I mean, we're trying to launch pretty big satellites, and SpaceX is obviously fantastic, but there's really not many options for us. And so, I'm pretty excited about Stoke.
Yeah, and by the way, I hate to do this, but I have another question because this is what happens. This is what happens when you talk to interesting people. So you mentioned Andy, you mentioned Stoke, and of course the first thing that comes to mind is that you guys share a pretty large institutional investor between the two of you guys, which is Breakthrough Energy. And I want to talk very, very briefly. I know we're running out of time. Just give me like a minute or two. Breakthrough Energy, and I think Shield, right, led your last round. Maybe talk a little bit about, we can talk very briefly about either, but I'm most interested in, or I'm most curious about sort of Breakthrough. Obviously, they have this huge climate focus. This is, Bill Gates's climate related investment vehicle, and he invested in Stoke. He's also invested in you guys. Maybe talk a little bit about your investors to date and how you think about that, or how they think about you, as I should say.
For sure. And I'll just throw in Initialize too, like you mentioned earlier. They've been fantastic for us. We're super excited to have them on board. But so Breakthrough Energy Ventures and Shield Capital co-led our Series A. That was really cool for us because they are both thesis-driven investors. Breakthrough, like you said, is climate, and Shields is they invest in dual-use companies, so that can serve both commercial and national security. And those are the core markets that we want to serve: climate and national security. So it was really cool for them to come together and co-lead, and they've both been phenomenal for us. To your question on Breakthrough, it's they kind of view the climate angle through 5 different categories that produce the biggest greenhouse gas emissions, and agriculture is one of the biggest ones. And so there's a lot of potential for us if we can, at scale, improve the efficiency of agriculture and crops and different applications there. You can actually have a pretty sizable impact on the emissions reduction through that. But then there's a bunch of other kind of, lists of use cases that do reduce emissions around preventing wildfires, measuring, verifying carbon credits in either forestry or crop soil, buildings leaking a bunch of energy, and using our thermal to see, where should you attack and put better windows in to attack kind of those really high energy leakage infrastructure. And then, measuring emissions directly is something that we can do today, or we will be able to do today with power plants for carbon emissions. And then eventually, depending on where in the infrared spectrum we expand into, measuring those directly, like direct methane emissions. And so for Breakthrough, they were really excited about all those use cases, plus just this VLEO kind of Earth observation platform that has so much potential to measure and monitor, all kind of the key aspects that feed into our climate problem today. So they've been phenomenal to work with, Breakthrough, and they're phenomenal. We've really enjoyed that.
Amazing. Well, I don't have any other questions. Or I do, but I'm not gonna ask.
Great questions, Mel. Yeah, I appreciate you. Talking through all that. This was awesome.
No, this is great, Topher. Thanks so much. I really appreciate you being on the show, and great to see you. And looking forward to having you on here again sometime soon.
Same. Thanks, Mo.
Okay. Bye.